Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's live stream debut of NCEA's newest issue brief, Energy Sanctions as a Foreign Policy Tool, How Successful and for How Long? I'm Portia Roberts, Deputy Executive Director for the National Center for Energy Analytics. I'm joined today by two of our NCEA visiting fellows, Matthew McManus, the author of our latest issue brief, Energy Sanctions as a Foreign Policy Tool, and Neil Atkinson. Matt and Neil, thanks for being here today. A quick word about our speakers. Matthew McManus retired in September 2025 from the U.S. State Department, where he worked on international energy and economic issues for more than 3 decades. He engaged on multilateral energy issues with G7, G20, OECD, and the Organization of American States, led states' energy analysis team, and helped shape U.S. energy security initiatives with Latin America, which included more than a dozen official visits to Venezuela, several with secretaries of energy. Matt holds a BA in economics and Spanish from the Holy Cross College and an MSFS from Georgetown, where he's also an adjunct professor of energy diplomacy. Neil Atkinson has over 40 years of experience across global energy markets. Notably, he worked for Petróleos de Venezuela for 19 years. And most recently, he led the oil industry and markets division for the International Energy Agency from 2026 to 2021. His career spans industry research and advisory roles, and he's widely published, having testified on energy issues before the UK House of Commons and briefed NATO on energy security. Okay, so here's how we'll run the session today. Matt will start with a brief overview of the key findings from his brief, Energy Sanctions as a Foreign Policy Tool. And then Matt and Neil will discuss what energy sanctions can and can't achieve and what determines their staying power. We'll wrap up with audience Q&A. A quick housekeeping item, if you have questions, please email them to the email address you'll see on the screen. That email address is nceainfo@energyanalytics.org. Our team will compile questions for the end at the Q&A, and if we don't get to your question, we will email you after the conclusion of our live stream. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Portia. I'm delighted to be with you today to talk about energy sanctions as a foreign policy tool. Energy sanctions are a growing and mostly effective tool of American foreign policy. They're made possible by American energy abundance. And given recent events in Venezuela, Russia, and Iran, it's a very timely moment to note the concrete, if incremental, diplomatic benefits of energy sanctions. And my paper makes the case that these programs will remain a viable component of America's diplomatic toolkit. Now, we were once constrained by oil import dependence, vulnerability to external shocks, but now the United States wields energy abundance as a strategic asset. And so the U.S. either unilaterally or multilaterally with allies now imposes sanctions either from the Congress or defined by executive orders that are directly shaping diplomatic negotiations with Venezuela, Russia, and as we speak this morning, American negotiators are in Geneva for very rare face-to-face talks with Iran, brought to you, I believe, largely by energy sanctions. Now, how is it that the U.S. is able to impose these energy sanctions on some of the biggest energy producers in the world? It's because record production of all forms of American energy. And of this surging output, 65% of that is oil and gas. And oil and gas are the most traded international energy. So again, American presidents and the Congress were once constraining import dependence, no longer. As the world's largest producer of crude oil and the leading exporter of LNG, the U.S. now wields its global energy leadership backed by an ability with energy sanctions. And I think they're largely working. And what's really remarkable about our energy surplus is that we only export 30% of our primary energy production. And we're the #1 LNG exporter with only 20% of our gas being exported. And so what happens at home in our oil and gas and overall energy patch has international implications. And that's one of the top thoughts I'm going to leave with you today. So let's go to graph 1 about unilateral sanctions. Sanctions on Venezuela were made possible by the transformation of the North American energy landscape, particularly the really incredible steep increase of Texas's Permian Basin shale production and the tripling of Canadian heavy oil production since 2005. That reduced reliance on Venezuelan heavy crude oil. This market transformation opened the door to deeper unilateral economic and energy sanctions imposed by administrations of both parties. So you can see the US in blue, 130% increase over the time period. You can see the tripling of Canadian oil production since 2005. And you can see after the inauguration in 1999 of Hugo Chavez, the deterioration in Venezuelan oil. And let's return to the narrative. So, sharply reduced Venezuelan energy production, exports, and revenues, stemming again from that overall deterioration since Chavez came to power in 1999, accelerated by direct sanctions on state oil concern PDVSA in 2019 by Trump 1 administration, and the recent naval blockade by the Trump administration only in December greatly increased pressure on an anti-democratic, corrupt Venezuelan regime. Now, the strong suite of enforced sanctions and the heroic Delta Force arrest of Nicolas Maduro left Venezuelans interim authorities in reach of the long arm of American justice and cut off from crude oil revenues. But to cooperate with the United States, which thus far they are mostly doing. We have executive orders and Treasury General Licenses 46 through 50 that control and distribute Venezuela's oil revenues, combined with sanctions rollback. So the other part of the power of sanctions is you can impose them and you can slowly roll them back as cooperation is achieved. And I really believe that's the glue holding together diplomatic efforts that have spurred a new hydrocarbons law, opened the door of Caracas's notorious El Code political prison, hastened the departure of Cuban military advisors who were a big part of holding back democracy in Venezuela, and ignited the hope for my friends watching today from Caracas of a democratic Venezuela Libre. Now let's turn to Russia 4 years after their brutal attempt to invade Ukraine. We have multilateral sanctions imposed on Russia. And now, admittedly, as Neil and I are going to talk about, overall oil production has not fallen as much as in the case of Venezuela, but overall government revenues have fallen by quite a bit. Now, how are these sanctions enforced? By the G7 plus Australia, the US, the EU, big restrictions in Russian oil and gas production. And that's caused Russia, rather than selling to the proximate lucrative market of Europe, which they have lost forever, they now have to sell their oil in distant markets in Asia. The IEA estimates that in November of 2025, a combination of lower oil exports, largely due to sanctions, prices have reduced Russia's monthly oil revenues to 11 billion, about 4 billion lower than a year ago. And Goldman Sachs reported in 2025 that Russia's overall oil export revenues fell by half in rubles, from about 8% to 4% of GDP. Even the Russian Ministry of Finance reported that oil and gas tax revenues fell by 34% year over year. And what has enabled these sanctions to be put on Russia? Again, it's backstopping the pressure by American LNG, whose exports to Europe have more than doubled since 2019, helping replace Russian supplies and helping European governments, the EU, impose some 19 sanctions packages. So lower energy revenues, shrinking tax receipts in Moscow underscore a central point, which is that sanctions bite harder when alternative supplies exist. And in this case, it's the United States. Now let's turn to Iran, where again today, Iranian and American negotiators are meeting. And here we have multilateral United Nations and US sanctions targeting oil sales, financial institutions. They've really constrained Iran's access to hard currency, forced discounted crude sales. Like Russia, they have to use the shadow fleet of rickety tankers where they turn off the transponders and they try to bring their oil to Asian markets. But what's happening now is they're parked offshore, incurring a lot of additional costs. They have to sell it for about $11 a barrel less because of the sanctions make them go through because they're not complying with these alternative ways. So sanctions, even multilateral ones, unless you have a naval blockade, as we do in Venezuela, they don't eliminate exports, but they do reduce government revenues. They do raise friction in internal pressures that are greatly weakening the regime. And we saw the heroic protests by the Iranian people. And so Iran, again, is back at the negotiating table. So overall, if you look at all three cases, Washington can now pursue foreign policy goals free of the constraints and insecurity. And we now have our own energy tool. This American energy freedom allows diplomatic engagements in the Middle East to transcend oil sales, empowers our European allies to stand up to Russian energy coercion, and is supporting the restoration in our own hemisphere. Not bad, if you ask me. Now, as the use of energy sanctions as a foreign policy tool shows, sanctions do not eliminate, but they likely reduce the need for kinetic force to achieve foreign policy goals. Energy sanctions alone will not achieve all of our diplomatic goals in any of these countries or regions, but they greatly advance them. And I'd love to bring in now my colleague Neil, who's joining us from Paris, to have a fireside chat.
Thanks, Matt. Really terrific paper that you've written, and I hope everybody who hasn't had time to actually read the paper itself yet will do so pretty quickly and pass it on to friends and colleagues. Like Matt, I know Venezuela pretty well. In my case, I worked for Petroleos de Venezuela for 19 years, and I'm old enough to remember the days when the ambitions of Petroleos de Venezuela stretched to raising production capacity to 5.6 million barrels a day by the mid-2000s. Obviously, happy days, and things have changed dramatically. In another life, I also visited Iran 5 times towards the end of the 2000s as an energy consultant. In my case, or in the case of the company that I worked for, sanctions brought an end to our activities, and the sanctions in those days were financial as opposed to anything else. We couldn't get paid, so we stopped working. Unfortunately, I don't know Russia too well directly, but anyhow, some good points have come up that I'd like to pick up on with Matt, I should say. Not many years ago, if sanctions had been imposed on any one of Venezuela, Russia, or Iran, oil prices would probably have spiked, and my colleagues at the International Energy Agency would have been looking at whether an emergency stop drawdown was warranted and should be recommended. Until last month's US action in Venezuela, we had sanctions against all 3 countries simultaneously. Russia and Iran, of course, are still sanctioned. In the case of Russia, sanctions, as Matt was saying, were explicitly aimed at reducing revenues rather than necessarily reducing shipments. So the difference these days is that oil and gas production in the US, as Matt said, has risen sharply in the last couple of decades, but we shouldn't forget also as a contribution to rising supply to global markets. We shouldn't forget Canada and Brazil, which have both seen sharply higher production in the last couple of decades. So basically, Matt, as a foreign policy expert who's worked really right under the hood of a lot of these issues over the years, how important has the US upsurge in production been in considering sanctions regimes, and also whether IEA emergency stock releases are necessary?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I would say in most of my career, it was unthinkable that it would be the US imposing a naval embargo on Venezuela. It would be unthinkable that we could, constrain 3 problematic actors in foreign policy with oil sanctions. We're now producing a record high of 13.6 million barrels per day. That's an inconvenient truth for OPEC, because where is incremental oil production coming from? It's not only the United States, it's from Brazil.
Hey, Matt, we lost you for a second. We're going to give you a minute to just get your audio connection back.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So I think let me turn it over to Neil for the next question.
I think what we were saying here was that the rise of Brazil, Guyana, Venezuela, Canada and the United States from very little oil 20 years ago to an awful lot now has, of course, made the imposition of sanctions, which would have been unthinkable 20 years ago, now thinkable and indeed doable. And that's the big change we've seen in the last few years. And if Matt is able to pick up that point now, which I think he was developing, excuse me, when he got interrupted.
Great. Thank you, Neil. Do we hear audience questions?
Matt, do we still have you? All right, we might have to wait for
what
Matt
I can
to
do while we're still waiting for Matt, I can pick up on a point here, which was he'll come back and perhaps finish off this issue of the other suppliers. But there's another great point in Matt's paper, which we're going to come on and discuss in a second, I hope, when he comes back. And that's related to artificial intelligence. And, artificial intelligence is all the rage these days. And there are an awful lot of energy forecasts out there which are saying that staggering amounts of electricity are going to be needed in the United States, and indeed probably in other countries, to meet the demand from data centers. And of course, we can't know exactly how much electricity is going to be needed. Nobody really knows how fast the industry actually will develop, but it's going to be a lot. There's no question of that. So what Matt has said in his paper, which I think is a really brilliant point, there's a great section where he talks about the role of gas in meeting rising electricity demand in the US. And then Matt links this potential need for more gas and electricity generation in the US to the rise of US LNG, because the US has become the world's biggest LNG exporter. It's overtaken Qatar and Australia in recent years. And of course, crucially, 70% of US LNG exports go to Europe. And that has helped, of course, enormously in reducing the dependence of Europe on Russian gas exports. So, Matt, if you've heard that last bit that I said, can you pick it up from that?
Great, thank you so much. There's a huge competition between the competition for AI, for gas. I know NCA looked at that. Almost the same volume of gas that we're exporting now, we're going to need just to meet the 55 gigawatts of projected demand from the AI sector. So we can't make forward-looking forecasts, but we know there'll be an increasing amount of competition between the LNG sector and the AI sector. At the same time, we know that EIA is increasing American gas production 2% this year, another percent next year. It's over 100 per year, billion cubic feet. So I think the gas is there, but the economic competition will increase.
Yeah, the other interesting point about this, when I was preparing for this, I looked up some data, and using EIA data, which is of course publicly available, at the end of last year, the total operating US LNG export capacity was 18 billion cubic feet per day. Fine, that's a fact, and that's happening now. However, there's currently about another 15 billion cubic feet per day of export capacity is actually under construction. And if all goes to plan, those projects will be commissioned between the middle of this year and the end of 2031. So I don't know, if you're an LNG export, you're a liquefaction investor in the United States committing in total billions of dollars to that sector, yet you've got AI demand in the United States coming up through on the rear view mirror. Now, what would you feel if you were an investor in liquefaction capacity in the US? Would you start canceling projects? Would you revise your view? I don't know. It's a tough one.
And you know, Neil, I live here in Virginia, which is, you know, ground zero for many of the data centers. And I would pose that same question to the producers of data centers, right? Are they going to build all the? We don't know, but I think that the energy sector here is doing a great job. We have over the horizon SMRs; they're not here yet, but in the interim, we have this record amount of natural gas. So let's maybe now go to overall audience questions.
Okay, great. Yeah, we can do that. Thank you both so much. I'll start with one here. If the global oil price is too low for U.S. shale companies to drill profitably, does the U.S. lose its ability to use energy as a weapon? Basically, the question is, as U.S. shale growth slows and other countries start their own fracking, are we seeing the end of U.S. swinging producing capabilities and the resulting leverage?
That's a great question. If we look at like who's fracking lately, in Argentina, they're up to about 700,000 barrels per day, and 60% of that is from fracking, a lot of it from American investment. And I think really what fracking around the world is doing vis-a-vis balances is helping those not in OPEC, because OPEC really doesn't frack, they don't need to. It's helping put additional barrels on the market. Again, of the 1.1 million barrels of new oil put on the market this year, almost all of it was in the Western Hemisphere, again, Guyana, Brazil, Argentina. So that I think is a helpful addition to the supply base.
Great. Neil, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, my view on that is fracking is very important, and shale production growth in Argentina is very important. I get all that. However, in terms of investment, global investment in the upstream sector, oil and gas sector in the last decade, investment remains below the level it reached before the pandemic. And I think checking the data, it's still roughly the same as it was 10 years ago. And the point about that is that investment, yes, of course, there's capital efficiency, there's technical efficiency, and you can get more barrels for your bucks. But investment overall still remains relatively low. And the point about that is that if you believe, as I do, and the National Center for Energy Analytics certainly believes, that demand for oil is going to continue to grow for many years to come. The IEA's current policy scenario sees oil demand growing out to 2050. If you believe demand is going to continue to grow, we are going to continue to need more investment in the upstream oil and gas sector, because if we don't do that, there is a risk. We don't know how big the risk, but there is a risk that there won't be sufficient supply, not only to actually meet demand, but also to have a cushion of spare capacity to offset any shocks that we have. So yeah, all the shale investment in Argentina or elsewhere, the growth in conventional production in Brazil and in Canada and in Guyana is very welcome, but we're going to need it all if you believe that oil demand is going to go up for a long time to come.
Sounds like it. So our next question also on LNG. Can you speak to the shale depletion and its impact on our obligations to deliver LNG to customers, particularly in the EU?
That's a really great question. And when, only about 10% of the resources available in hydraulic fracking, both in oil and gas. And so I think Javier Blas is watching. He notes an article about Shale 4.0, where companies are working on new technologies. They're using AI. They're using new surfactants, propping open the rock more broadly to try to bring it up to about the 30% yield that you get in conventional energy. And so already in the Permian and Pennsylvania, using these new technologies to really make sure that the shale resource is not temporary, but it's over the longer period. And we see that that is working. In fact, just from workovers of Permian oil, where you have associated gas, you're going to get 2.7 billion cubic feet a day additional gas just from using those technologies to get more oil for the Permian.
Yeah, I've got great faith in the engineering ingenuity and efficiency that we see in the U.S. shale sector. If we remember, in the first growth phase of U.S. shale from the mid-2000s to about 2015, when the price war broke out and production in the U.S. shale sector and elsewhere in the U.S. fell quite sharply, what happened, rather than everybody saying, oh, prices are far too low, they can't recover from this, the technology improvements that they made and the capital efficiency that they were able to improve was quite impressive and quite extraordinary. And while we can't obviously guarantee that that will always be the case in the future, I don't think we should underestimate the ability of the sector to adjust and to improve technology. And as Matt was saying, get those recovery rates up to a higher level. Because obviously today, what we see is that the depletion rate in US shale is way higher than it is in the conventional oil fields, which I think the global average is something in the region of 8 to 10%, something like that. In some of the shale provinces, it's way above 30. Unless you re-drill, then you're going to lose oil. So yeah, let's I think give great credit to the U.S. shale sector for its operational and technical efficiency and its constant ability to improve.
Great. We still have got questions rolling in, actually. So I'm going to take us to the half hour, and then if everyone's good with that, I'll just end after that. But briefly, both of you, are you optimistic about the future of Venezuela?
Matt?
Let me quickly, I think so. I think the developments I noted, again, we have many political prisoners released, and they were involved in campaigns. I don't think they'll be able to quiet them, and hopefully their voices will be heard as the oil revenues help pave the way toward elections.
I am optimistic. I'm hopeful that the U.S. will stick with the policy of essentially placing maximum pressure on the Venezuelan government and making sure that they do, in time, move towards elections and in time that the law and order situation can be stabilized and the food and fuel distribution can be stabilized to give everybody in the Venezuela the chance to develop. And if they do that, it's great for Venezuela, which is what I personally would love to see. But it's also great for the US because it means there's a stable, democratic country in its backyard, and that will help stabilize the entire region. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, definitely. So counter arguments to the notion that sanctions don't work.
Well, I think, as I point out in my paper, kinetic options are still needed. As Neil said, the amount of resource coming out of Russia hasn't decreased hugely. But again, I think a lot of the goals are reached by the reduction in revenues.
Yeah, absolutely. The Russian economy is really under strain. It's starting to be something that they can't hide, and Matt alluded to that in his earlier remarks. Sanctions, they've had a mixed record over history. We all know that. Cuba, I guess, is the shining example. But in the case of Russia, it looks as if it is gradually having a marked impact on the situation in their economy. It certainly had a deleterious impact on Venezuela. There's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. And Iran is a slightly different case because of things like the shadow fleet, the fact that countries like India and China were perfectly happy to continue buying oil from Iran, irrespective of US sanctions. So there's a mixed record, but they are having an impact in one way or another.
Yep, does seem so. So we have a couple more good questions. If you all are good staying another minute or two, I might
Absolutely.
yeah.
If they're easy ones, yeah.
Well, I'll let you off the hook a little on this one because it's about coal. We are going to be doing producing some research on coal this year at NCEA, at least global usage of coal. But the question is, does it seem odd that coal usage is not rebounding?
Sorry, where?
Exactly. That's why my next question is not specific to which geography, because I think it is in some places in the world.
Because global demand for coal is was a record in 2025.
Yeah. At what cost does NATO expansion come? I'm not sure what that question means exactly.
Well, I think that one clear benefit of our LNG revolution is that we were able to again backstop our allies in a market way, many of them NATO allies, as we stand up to Russian coercion. Without the ability to have energy, Europe would not have been able to do those 19 very tough sanctions on Russia.
Oh yeah, the US LNG is an absolute game changer. There's no question of that. And 70% of US exports go to Europe now. It's a big deal. Although, as a cheeky foreigner, if I can say this, US LNG exporters haven't been giving it away. So, it's good for business for them as well as for European security.
As a follow-on question to that, do you see there a chance of Europe having a come to Jesus moment and either investing in fracking or taking its own low road and going back to Russia for gas supply?
Let's hear from Paris.
Okay. I was joking with Chris Wright when I met him the first time in DC a couple of years ago before he took over, that underneath Paris, in the Paris basin, there are enormous gas reserves, apparently. And I was musing that they should start fracking in front of the Eiffel Tower. But in all seriousness, fracking is highly unlikely to take off in a big way in Europe, simply because of the proximity of the fields to urban areas. Certainly in my home country, the UK, it's hard to see it happening. And the geology is different, and shale deposits aren't the same everywhere. And Exxon, for example, looked very hard at Poland a few years ago as a possibility of developing shale resources there, and decided, mainly for geological and economic reasons, that it wasn't viable. So I would be hugely surprised if Europe were to open up significantly to shale development, and it's years away, even if it is possible at all.
Yeah. Last question I'm gonna lob at you two is any thoughts on the new Westinghouse contracts? It's not something we discussed. I don't think it was covered in the paper.
I don't
on SMRs?
It was a non-specific question.
Sure. Well, I think that, again, I mean, technology always solves a lot of these problems. And I think, we're talking now about the competition for gas in the AI sector. But just over the horizon, I really think we have viable small modular reactors as another opportunity. And that really takes care of the problem of the competition of gas in the AI sector.
Longer term, for sure. Well, we've gone a little over. We had some connectivity issues, but thank you all for hanging with us. We are going to be doing some more on that subject, Westinghouse, SMRs, nuclear, that sort of thing. So if you're curious about that and you're in our audience, please stay tuned over the next few months. We will be coming at you with more nuclear research. Thank you both so much for joining us. Matt, thank you for your hard work on this issue brief, obviously a timely one. Folks, if we missed your question during the live stream, please send us an email to nceainfo@energyanalytics.org or find us on social and send it to us that way. We monitor that. If you have additional questions, we will get back to you. We will reply. And of course, if you are looking for the issue brief itself or a recording of the live stream, you can find that on our website. We will post a link on our homepage, and it will both be available on a landing page for you to share, to re-review, download. And so thank you both.
Thank you, Portia.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, Neil.
Bye.